It's been a minute since Wes and I have done a recruiting rundown, but football season is back, which means we are back. Welcome into the recruiting rundown, everybody. Kendall Smith and Wes Mitchell here on Gamecock Central. And we're going to talk a little recruiting here today. So South Carolina coming off of their opening weekend in the 2024 season against Old Dominion. A tight game, but a lot of stakes riding on this game, not only for South Carolina to get a win, obviously, Wes, which they did, but some recruiting stakes as well. Several guys that came in to visit. We're going to talk about that throughout today's show and just kind of talk about the reactions and who was there at Williams-Brice Stadium to take in South Carolina's first game of the season. So how you doing, Wes? You recovering well from the first weekend of college football?
Yeah, I'm good. Hope the fan base is hanging in there. Obviously, a little bit of a rough day at Williams-Brice. South Carolina did get the win, though. And a decent day of recruiting just in terms of guys who made it in. You know, we'll talk maybe about what could be an even bigger weekend coming up here soon, Kendall. But there were some guys, both one big target from this current class, 2025, and then they really have started trying to get a head start on getting some of those 2026 prospects on campus as well.
It's crazy to hear you say 2026 already. We've been doing this for a couple of years. So every year, once the graduation year gets pushed back, it makes me feel a little bit older. But you talked about a big target there, and we'll go ahead and start with that today in the recruiting rundown. Michel Skinner, who is tight end, 4-star, who's currently committed to Cincinnati. South Carolina trying to flip him, and in a battle right now with Kentucky, oddly enough, who they face this weekend. So he was in town in Columbia this past weekend. Wes, what did you hear on his end?
Yeah, and to be clear, I've not spoken to him directly since the visit, but I have heard it went well. I did hear he made it in. He was expected in. We were told he did make it in. And this is a guy who kind of, you look at this 2025 class, most of it is already settled as far as South Carolina targets, but he's someone that they offered in the summer. He was already committed to Cincinnati. He's actually being recruited there by Josh Stepp, who is the brother of former Gamecock assistant Justin Stepp. Those guys, obviously, both Palmetto State natives. And so he's being recruited by Josh. He's committed to Cincinnati. But really, South Carolina and Kentucky have pushed into this mix and are trying to convince him to play SEC ball. Like we just said, he was in Columbia this past weekend. He's actually planning to be in Lexington, Kentucky this coming weekend. And we'll see South Carolina take on the Wildcats. And, you don't put a ton of stock into one game in recruiting, but certainly if you're a prospect and you're comparing two programs and there maybe you're 1 and 2 with, Cincinnati being committed there, they're obviously in the mix as well. But it gives you a kind of an opportunity, Kendall, to compare the two head to head directly. So I think that's a fascinating storyline for this weekend. And Skinner is someone that Steve Wiltfong, who is one of the national recruiting guys with On3, he actually has his prediction in for Kentucky to land Skinner at this point. At the same time, I've been told that was kind of a dream offer when South Carolina offered him, like the opportunity to play in his home state, to not go so far from home. Those things weigh in big here as well. So I think this is one, if you're a Gamecock fan, pay close attention to it. This weekend could be big on either side. But then I would obviously look for Carolina to do everything they can to try and get Skinner back on campus in Columbia in the coming weeks as well.
Yeah, I think that's the natural question that a lot of people would have if Skinner goes and when he goes to Kentucky this weekend. Do you think a decision could be coming soon after that, or do you think he will try to make his rounds once again to both campuses before he ultimately decides to flip, if he does decide to flip?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I don't have a direct answer on that yet, but I think obviously if you're South Carolina, you're just kind of hoping to survive this weekend without him committing to Kentucky while he's up there. I need to confirm, there was some talk about this even being an official visit to Kentucky, which obviously means they're going to get him on campus, if so, for quite some time. I know the visit is planned. We'll see if that's official or unofficial, but Kendall, I think a big weekend there. Carolina does face LSU next week, their SEC opener. We expect, regardless of what has happened on the field, we expect a big crowd as always. Gamecock Nation will show out. If I'm Carolina, I'm doing everything I can to get him committed to being on campus again in Columbia for that game.
We'll talk a little bit more about the LSU game here in just a couple of minutes, but want to continue talking about this past weekend. You put out an expected visitors list a few days before the game, and actually a couple of guys from Charlotte, North Carolina came to the game that weren't on that list. So who were they, Wes, and what did they think?
Yeah, Kendall, this is a situation where, we're still trying to figure out when it comes to 2026s, 2027s, who are the guys we need to pay attention to. In other words, a school is going to send out well more offers than they can actually take commitments from. So you're talking about offers eventually being up into the 100s, sometimes 200s of prospects. So which guys do Gamecock fans need to know? I think we're still formulating that. A couple of 2026s, again, like you said, we didn't expect on campus. We didn't have Elijah Littlejohn, who's like a 4-star linebacker edge type from Charlotte. We didn't have him on our initial list. I don't know if that was just an oversight on our part or if it was a late addition, but Littlejohn was on campus. Rodney Dunham, who's actually the number 6 edge prospect in the 2026 class, 4-star guy, big-time prospect that I'm told has kind of emerged as a priority for South Carolina. He was on campus. A couple of guys that they just offered recently, Bryce B.J. Robinson, who's kind of a defensive line edge type, probably a highly recruited guy, not ranked yet, but is going to be from Georgia. He was in town. And then I know people, Kendall, like to know about the in-state guys. Who are the in-state guys I need to know? And Contavian Anderson, who's a kid out of Dorman, class of 2026, South Carolina has already offered him. They offered him, I think, maybe a month or two ago. He's got an offer from the Gamecocks. He was on campus and, just gave rave reviews about it. This is a kid I can always tell, Kendall, when it's a prospect who either grew up pulling for the Gamecocks or just at the very least kind of really respects and appreciates the opportunity to play for their home state school. And that was the vibe I got from talking to him, exchanged some messages with him over the weekend after the trip. And he gave me some really just well thought out, in-depth answers, was just very involved in talking about South Carolina. And so that may be an in-state guy. Again, that's Contavian Anderson from Dorman. That may be an in-state guy to go ahead and look ahead to, I should say, that Carolina is probably in pretty good shape with.
Well, we just talked about it, South Carolina, obviously with Kentucky this weekend, and then looking forward to LSU back at home at Williams-Brice Stadium. You're expecting, obviously, a lot of guys to come out for that game. I know the South Carolina staff is expecting Willie B to be rocking so they can make a good impression on a lot of these guys. But looking ahead, what can we expect for that LSU weekend, Wes?
Yeah, and we'll obviously have details on exact prospects to watch on GamecockCentral.com as we get closer and closer to that weekend. But there is already sort of some buzz, even before the season started, of that LSU game kind of being circled as we always talk about these, quote, big recruiting weekends, Kendall. And there's always a couple, maybe 2, 3 of them throughout each season as far as your home games go. A lot of times it's going to be an SEC opponent or Clemson, and it's going to be a situation where you expect maybe just a little extra juice from that crowd. We know Williams-Brice Stadium always rocking. And we'll see if Carolina fans can get out there early for this noon kick. That's probably not ideal. Obviously, you'd rather it be a little bit later in the day, but certainly in terms of opponent, SEC opener, a chance for South Carolina to steal a victory, they're going to push to get these prospects on campus. And again, fans can make a difference, Kendall. It's not even always about wins or losses or stuff like that in that particular game. It's really more about the experience, the environment, and sort of just how they feel when they're on campus. Now, big picture, I will say the Gamecocks need to clean this thing up quick from what we saw this past Saturday, because there's a lot of recruits that are highly interested in this program that I think have been just a little put off by 5-7 last year. And part of that is that other coaching staffs are just hammering Carolina on that. So I do think having some early season success, that's something we've pointed to as being important in recruiting moving forward. So, we all saw the game on Saturday. You got to hope, if you're a Gamecock fan, that a lot of what we saw was just kind of week one sloppiness as opposed to just maybe what this team is going to be. You can make a lot of improvements from week one to week two. But if you're Carolina, if you're a fan, if you're kind of down about it, you got to hope that that's what we see, that we see a big jump with South Carolina going to this massive, really, it's a huge game for them this week in Kentucky.
We have circled this Kentucky game since we received the schedule. So everyone certainly looking forward to this weekend. And Wes, I think you're 100% right. We see so many teams make big leaps and big jumps from week 1 to week 2 because Shane Beamer has talked about this multiple times. You don't get preseason games in college football. You just got to rock with it on week 1, see what you got. And from there, you take the tape, you see what you have, and you kind of make adjustments. So looking for some improvements, obviously, for South Carolina, but they're not the only team in the country. They're not the only team in the country that's going to be making their improvements and taking what they need from week 1 to try to get better in week 2. But as always, we will keep you posted on GamecockCentral.com, on our social media channels at Gamecock Central, with not just recruiting related topics, but every topic that you could think about regarding the Gamecocks. So Wes, appreciate your insight as always. Thank you all so much for watching. For Wes Mitchell, I'm Kendall Smith, and this has been the Recruiting Rundown. It's back, everybody. We've been gone for a minute, but we are back, and thank you for watching.